Hey everyone, it's AZ, your host, and today in episode 106, I had the opportunity to sit down with Russ Burnham, who is another good dude from Frontline Mobile Health. Frontline is a veteran-owned company leveraging its military experience and human talent to develop relevant health and wellness programs for public safety organizations across the nation. We had the best conversation about making policies and how that's important for your organization and how it protects you as the employee, as well as your supervisors and your employer. You are not going to want to miss this. So give it a listen. Please give me a rating and a review on your podcast platform. I appreciate you being here. Now, here's Russ. Thank you for joining me on the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, AZ. I find the research and resources and then provide the fire service with the so what, now what, to ensure the health and well-being of every member of our profession. Together, let's thrive. So, firefighters have very short attention spans. You know this. So I try to stay like 45 minutes, but if it goes over or a little bit under, I don't care.
Sure.
Do you have hard stop times though?
No, not till 4:30 my time, which is in 2.5 hours.
Oh my God.
So it's really awesome if we go that long.
We'll have to take bathroom breaks, get a snack.
I'm surprised Mike didn't have to take one while you were doing his. Poor guy's got the smallest bladder alive. So.
Oh, I did not know that.
Mm-hmm.
I knew he had wild children. He told me the wild children, but I didn't know about small bladder.
Oh yeah, tiny bladder. Like he's got a little girl bladder.
Did you listen to the episode?
Say, a little bladder. He'll be like, "Oh yeah, no, it's true. I do. It's like the size of a baseball."
Oh my God! Did you listen to the episode?
Oh yeah, no, I did. It was great. I thought it was great. That's why I'm sorry you didn't take a potty break with Mike. So.
Well, he did say he was too pretty for prison, but he also said that you were prettier. So that's where we are.
Yeah, he's always jealous of my jawline, but I'm losing my hair. And but Mike has this funny joke that says Asian don't raisin because he's Filipino, but we always accuse him of being Mexican because he could probably go either way.
Poor Mike. We should not be like trampling him behind his back.
This is how we do it at Frontline for sure. Like Mike can dish it out with the best of them. He's actually probably the biggest culprit of inappropriate comments. So.
Well, anyway, how about, should we introduce you and then just like dive into it? That's what I think we should do.
Let's do it.
All right. Listeners, 2 episodes ago, you got to hear from Mike Connor with Frontline Mobile Health. And now you are going to get to hear from Russ, also from Frontline Mobile Health. Russ, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Annette. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to have you sort of introduce yourself. Are you ready? I'll ask the questions. You vomit the answers.
Let's do it.
Okay. Who is Russ Burnham?
I'm just a guy trying to make it in the world, in all honesty. I was a late bloomer, meaning I didn't find what I wanted to do until I was 22. But as soon as I did that and really came to a conclusion that I just wanted to help people, and I was really committed to doing hard things. And it's kind of driven everything else. I'm a father of 7. I'm a husband to my wife, Elizabeth. We've been married for 24 years. We live on a little hay farm in south of Fort Worth and love trimming trees. I think I'm an amateur arborist, or I'd like to consider myself that. And found a new desire for doing pottery, shockingly enough. So that's what I do in my spare time, and try to change the world in the public safety space when I'm not doing those things.
So random. And we're going to go down a rabbit hole right now.
Sure.
Listeners cannot see this, but I am looking at a helmet, a firefighting helmet in your background. Tell me what that's all about.
Oh, that was given to me as a gift from one of my patients who retired from the Fort Worth Fire Department. And he was so just grateful for what, he had some health issues and medical things, and he retired on his own terms and was just so very grateful. And I'd sort of joked around because I'd been in his office before. And I was like, hey, man, maybe I could get one of those helmets those days. And so when he retired, he walked down and handed it to me. And it just so happened that it was my favorite number, too. He was from Station 20, but 20 is my favorite number. And so that was just totally random. And I was like, okay, well, this was meant to be. And it was pretty awesome. So, yeah, I put it there. And you should probably notice that, too. I know they can't see it, but that's the Pflugerville patch. We could go into history there because you've had a lot of people on the podcast from there. But there's a really good story as to how we got to this podcast. But it all kind of started there.
I'm writing down Pflugerville because I'm actually having Chief Perkins on the podcast in a couple of weeks. So It's like a big incestuous circle. I love it.
Yeah.
All right. So now we know who you are. What sets your soul on fire?
I find fulfillment by helping other people find fulfillment. I think that's really the what sets my soul on fire is that I don't really care what you do, but I want to help you find a way to do those things. And sometimes just asking the question of like, well, what fulfills you? It's really interesting that sometimes a lot of us don't ask ourselves that questions. And so when I ask that question of other people, they kind of look at me blankly. And I said, hey, it's a great place to start, man. But like, what are you doing? Why are you here? What sets your soul on fire? But I've really sort of distilled it down to I really care about people. I really want to help them live as long as they can, if that's what their goal is. Most of the time, people aren't saying like, yeah, I'm ready to get out of here as fast as I can. Usually I have yet to get that answer when I ask it. And so it's just like, hey, those are the things that get you up in the morning and those are the things that make it worthwhile. And that's just become a passion of mine. And so that's what sets my soul on fire, whether that's in the professional space, in the private space, it doesn't matter because I think that if we're all fulfilled, we bring the better part of ourselves to the world and we need more of that, honestly. So.
I recently retired at the age of 53, and it is my goal to collect my pension for 53,
That's right.
53 years while being healthy and a real pain in the ass. So
absolutely.
I love what you're doing.
Yeah.
All right, then. You sort of hit on it already, but how are you changing the world?
Yeah, I think I think I'm very blessed, like doing exactly what this is, right? I do want to change the world. And sometimes you have to ask yourself, hey, well, where is that most likely to happen? I spent 20 years of my life in the Army and absolutely owe everything to the Army. I mean, the Army gave me my career, my education, my experience. We get into the origin story a little bit of, how we got here. I mean, it's very much what Frontline does. That was the original ask anyways, really kind of bore out of what we did in the military. But the problem is the military is so big. It's so huge that I was really at a point in my life about 15 years in where it's like, hey, I love the Army so much. And I know I want to give all that I got to help make it better for the men and women that serve in uniform. The reality is that, hey, look, I didn't go to West Point. I wasn't an infantry officer. I was a PA. There's too many doctors and nurses and infantry officers that get a chance to promote up just based off of the career choice you choose. And so I said, hey, I could stay for another 35 years, stay till 35 years and maybe change 0.1% if I just gave everything I possibly had. And so what I decided otherwise was that, hey, that there's a real need in the public safety space. And that really set my soul for it. It's like, hey, this is probably easier to move, just as important. Because we have so many veterans that serve as cops and firefighters. It's unbelievable. So it's a really great way to continue to serve with other men and women. And I just want to make my work meaningful. And I want the work of everybody that comes into contact with Frontline and our patients. I want them to, I want to change the world one patient at a time. And then if we can put all those patients together, maybe we can change a whole industry at a time. And that's the goal. And that's what we're doing. We're living it out.
I think that is the coolest goal ever. And I really want to know, Mike talked about being a good dude. Tell me, just where did that come from? Because I love that. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, it actually came from, there was a West Point graduate. I forget what the venue was. It might have been the Institute for Modern Warfare. But there was just a paper that talked about, leaders being the good. Well, it was real about the good dude rule, right? And when you read it, you're like, oh yeah, it makes sense. I just never had heard of it. And the reality is it's kind of one of those things that, hey, you know it when you see it. And really, I distilled it down for me as like, hey, being a good dude is no bullshit and give a shit. If you can just do those two things, the rest usually takes care of itself. And so even on our job postings on the Frontline website, we say, hey, one of the requirements for working at Frontline is to be a good dude or dudette. And if you don't know what that means, then you shouldn't apply, because you really, hey, look, just Alan Brimacini's whole thing was just be nice, right? Like, gosh, it's so amazing how far we can get when we're just nice to people. You can tell them really terrible things, so the content of the communication can be pretty abrasive, but the way in which you communicate that stuff goes so far, and you will either shut somebody down or you will open them up based off those things. And so, I really try to assume positive intent in everybody and everything. And I think that that's kind of like, hey, and if you're coming from a place of like, you just want to help people, then, hey, look, you can't shut them down before you get an opportunity to help them. And so to do that means, hey, you don't bullshit them, but you got to tell them in a way that, help communicate to people in a way that they can receive that information. And everybody's a little different, right? So that's kind of what it means to me. But, it's one of those things like, yeah, Brumacini said it in his own way, which was just be nice. Just be nice. Be nice to your coworkers, be nice to your teammates, be nice to your family. And then more importantly, I think opportunities and venues like this is like, hey, well, when you're not doing so hot, actually talking about it is probably one of the best things, and acknowledging like, hey man, I'm not being a good dude right now, and I just need to talk to somebody. We all live in community, and I think when you get around good people, I used to joke around that with my wife, that when I got out of PA school, I said, hey, I could do proctology all day long if I had good people to work with. And the truth of what I was really trying to say was that I can do some pretty uncomfortable things, a lot of it, as long as I had good people to do it with, right? And very much in my military career, that was the way. Some of my worst experiences were some of the best because of the people that I served with. And so that's kind of, bred into what we do at Frontline, and kind of how I've decided to kind of live my life, is that I just want to be a good dude, and I want to be around other good dudes and dudettes. And boy, if we could just be nice to each other, so much would be less difficult in this life. It already is difficult enough.
You just really distilled it for me, because there was a period of my career where I was definitely not being a good dude, and that's not me.
Right.
And if I just had someone point that out to me at the time, like, hey, you're not being a good dude right now, and you are a good dude, that would have been so helpful.
Yeah.
Man.
It's the same thing about firefighter suicide, right? When something happens, everybody's like, oh yeah, we knew Jim and we knew something was going on, but nobody said anything, right? Like, we're afraid. You mentioned it with Mike that, sometimes actually saying something, hey, no bullshit, like saying something to being like, hey, Annette, what's going on? This is not like you, and you're just like, whoa, hey, first, the classic thing is, first the truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off. So, there's the whole stages of grief that you'd have to go through, but you'd get to that point of acceptance and you'd be like, man, you know what? That's right. I really hated that person for pointing that out, but hopefully if you, with some insight, you'd get there, and then you'd be a better person and bring that better person of yourself to the world. And that's what the world needs. So I think we all have to be a little more brave when it comes to that.
Yeah. And that takes just so much courage to open your mouth and say, man, you are not yourself right now.
Yeah, it is. It's very hard. It's very hard. And, but that's, you get good at it the more you practice, right? The more you practice. We have, just in our patient interactions, you get a lot of practice doing that. I'm assuming, even in the fire service, I was never a firefighter, but, gosh, so much of the fire service now is EMS and dealing with people on the worst day of their life. And, it's, they need a good dude or dudette at those times, right? It's just, but life happens. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that, can we just be a good dude all the time? I think that's what we should strive for. We have to also acknowledge, like, hey, shit happens and it's tough. And most of the time is if we just have other good people around us that'll say something, man, it help you get through those rough patches so much more. And, well, we're going to talk about policy and all those things like that. I mean, very much it's like, how do you create a culture or even a policy of like taking care of each other? But sometimes taking care of each other is pretty cut and dry. Like, hey, look, like no bullshit like this to get taken care of. These are the rules. This is what we got to do. So.
Well, before we get to that, because that is like the meat and potatoes of what I want to talk about, I want to talk a little bit about this whole origin story. So let me lay it out for the listeners. A few years ago, I met Queen Vanessa, who is just amazing, amazing, amazing. She is the coordinator at Pflugerville, hard to pronounce, fire. Through Vanessa, then of course, I met Mike, who is on the podcast. I already knew Jacob, who is collaborating on research with you. And now I have Russ in the family and pretty soon Chief Perkins. But I also understand that Pflugerville is kind of woven into your story, correct?
No, very much. Yeah. So let me take you back. So in the military, much like the fire service, a lot of times if you want to get promoted, you have to go get more education, right? You have to learn more skills, all those things. So I got back from my first deployment from Afghanistan after being a PA. And I was stationed at Fort Drum, New York, and it was time for me to PCS. And the Army said, "Hey, Russ, well, if you want to stay in and get promoted, you got to go get some more training. You've done your first kind of tour as a family practice PA. So what are you going to do?" And so I was very interested in aviation medicine, actually. I'd heard good things. It was something I was like, yeah, this is a new challenge. And that's actually where I met Mike, was at the flight surgeon course. And, the Army did a really good job of basically saying, hey, a medical emergency, such as a heart attack or a stroke, or, overexertion, or all the things that kind of firefighters and cops run into, when you're on a 30-person platoon on the ground, kind of moving towards the objective. A medical emergency at that time is concerning, and it's really more a leadership challenge, but it's not necessarily catastrophic, right? Like, just think of the ratio, right? One person of 30, you have 29 other people that can cover, move, help, right? You're usually a little closer to support assets. And so the way you would treat someone's blood pressure, if a soldier had high blood pressure, you'd treat it very differently on the ground than what you would do if they were a pilot, right? So, the contrary point to that is, okay, now instead of 30 people, you have 2 people in a $33 million aircraft. There wasn't $33 million worth of equipment on all 30 of those soldiers, right? You have 2 people, $33 million minimum price for an Apache Longbow helicopter. You push them way far advance of the front line. These are scout helicopters. You have people very far away. People usually don't survive helicopter crashes. It's a very dangerous, like, helicopters shouldn't even fly, right? Like, it's just basically through sheer brute force that they do. And, they said, hey, you got to think about it differently, right? The risks of this job are very different than the one you just came from. And you can't do the same type of medicine, the same type of advice. The requirements are different, like the vision and the hearing for a pilot is extremely important. Even more so than an infantry soldier, right? And we would have different standards. Hey, to be an infantry soldier, you could have this level of vision, this level of hearing. For a pilot, it was much higher. We didn't let people go to flight school. They didn't get kicked out of the Army, but you'd have soldiers that want to go to flight school, and because they have eyes, their vision, their visual acuity or depth perception is just off. You can't fly. And so, they just said, hey, look, you got to think about medicine differently. It was a real eye opener. It was awesome. And so I make it to Fort Hood, Texas, now Fort Cavazos. And, with being there about 3 months, my wife's like, this is boring. I'd like friends. And I said, okay, yes, we should have friends. So she met a lady through the local community. We said we should get our husbands together. And what do husbands do, right? The first thing we usually say to each other is like, well, what do you do? What do you do? He said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a flight surgeon up at Fort Hood, and I take care of pilots, and we do annual flight physicals. We screen people to come into aviation. We help them stay in flight. As they get older, they're going to come up with more medical problems. We want to keep them in the service as much as possible, and then we help them retire with dignity, right, so that they get all the benefits and things that they've earned. And he said, oh, that's very interesting. And I said, okay, that's why. Why is it interesting? He said, well, and I asked him, well, what do you do? And he said, well, I'm a battalion chief at Pflugerville. Now, that gentleman is the assistant chief of admin. His name's AJ Stacer, who Nick and AJ came up through the fire service together. But AJ just said, hey, can you do what you're doing in the Army for the fire service? That's it. And then just dropped the mic. And I never thought about it. I said, hey, man, I've never thought about it. I've been in the Army for 15 years. My mom and dad weren't on the job. I've been moving around the world. I just had never thought about it. And he said, well, you should. He said, we've been trying to go to 2 different hospitals an immobile company over the last 9 years, and we can't get anybody to listen to us about what are the true risks for our job. He gave me a vignette where he said, hey, we were going to a local occupational health clinic, and he goes in and sits in the waiting room, and he's sitting next to a morbidly obese man getting a DOT physical and a 14-year-old little girl getting a soccer physical, and they were all getting the same thing, right? And he's a firefighter, and he's just like, hey, look, like, and they tried to explain. I mean, when you talk to Nick, he'll tell you, I mean, they very much proactive people, like, hey, this is the problem, try to educate medical providers, and they just couldn't do it. And so, so I said, hey, I'm interested. And so AJ said, well, you should come down. Nick was the chief of training at that point in time. You should meet Nick. This is kind of, health and safety is his wheelhouse at that time. And we started talking, and Nick slid me a copy of the 2013 version of 1582. And he said, hey, man, if you really want to get into this space, you need to understand this. And Nick had also said, I've tried to give this manual to many other medical providers too, and can't seem to get anywhere. So he had low expectations, I think. But I opened it and I read it, and AJ let me do some ride-alongs. I went and hung out with the guys at the station, did some training with them, and I started to really understand what their concerns were. And I said, wow, this is a really interesting population. And I was kind of like that 15-year mark was like, hey, am I going to stay in the Army for another 20? Or what am I going to do when I hit my 20 years, right? And it was just a great opportunity to say, hey, this might be an opportunity to literally do what he asked, which is that, can I continue to do what we did in the Army, but do it for the fire service, which is now expanded to public safety. And that's what we've done. The whole MO, the whole everything we've done is, that was the original charter. That was the original ask. From their perspective, that was the need. Hey, look, if we could get a little bit more of that military mindset over here, we might actually make some progress on what firefighters and cops truly need. And so it's just been a ride since then. I mean, that was 7.5 years ago. That we actually started Frontline 9 years ago from the time that I met Nick. I mean, it didn't happen overnight, right? It took about 1.5 years to do this. And, I promised Nick, I said, hey, look, let's just try it for a year. I had no bigger aspirations. They were pretty clear that they hadn't had much success. And so we were just we're like, hey, we couldn't hurt by trying something new. And, but we did. And they very much have been, and why their patches on my shelf here is because they are very much mentors, our first customer ever. And they've doubled in size. They've taught us so much about the fire service. And they really are just an amazing organization, and they continue to push that envelope, and we're interested in pushing the envelope. Like, we don't really work with people that, when they come in and they're like, oh, well, it's expensive, or we don't do physical stuff. Well, why am I talking to you then? Like, if I have to convince you that that's there, I don't know. I'll go talk to somebody else, because we're not going to make any traction here. And if you obviously don't think it's important, then, hey, I'll go find, we'll go find our niche where people do agree that it is important. And what it's grown into, and I'll sort of segue into our conversation, is that what we've seen is that not many fire departments have really good policy when it comes to health and wellness, if any. It's kind of crazy. And if you go to FDIC, you listen to the guys on the Fire Law blog, Kurt Verone, Brad Pesky, these guys are, firefighters through and through, but they're also attorneys. And, I've been to several of their talks, and, what they would say is, they say, hey, if you want to get sued as a fire chief, rule number one, don't be a volunteer fire chief and embezzle money from your volunteer fire department. That will do it every time.
It's a good rule.
Yeah, pretty easy to state. And there's tons of stories out there. And then as soon as he said that, I started literally like seeing him in the news. I was like, damn, he wasn't kidding. And then the second one was, have somebody have a medical issue on your department, and then retroactively try to go back and institute a policy that keeps them off the truck. And I mean, you talk about going to hours of classes just talking about this, and then seeing how many departments were having it. So they've been talking about it for a while. The difference is I think now we're really trying to help departments say, hey, man, this actually is important. And one of the things that separates the military from the general kind of population is that there are standards, there are rules. It's a high-risk job, right? Like, we don't want to send our soldiers overseas to war to die. We want them to come back. We want them to be members of our community. We want them to continue to serve. But if it's just a free-for-all and there's no rules, we could really hey, look, in combat is the wrong time to have any medical emergency. I would argue that in a structure fire is also the wrong time to have a medical emergency. Hell, driving a fire truck in an urban environment, which I joke around is like, hey, that is a dangerous task all by itself. Like, you want to drive a tank through an urban environment. Yeah, like do that. Like that is dangerous, right? I mean, you watch the news in the last 5 years. What about engineers that have had a medical emergency while driving a fire truck, hurting their crew, hurting the people that you're trying to serve? And you're just like, man, like this is the wrong, like this is a high risk job. Even if you're not in a structure fire, just going to an EMS call is high risk for you. It's high risk for your crew. It's high risk for the general population. And so I sort of become fed up to be like, hey, like this lackadaisical, just like, hey man, anything goes. It's the good old boy network. I think those days are gone, and people will get eventually, I think that people will get fed up and be like, hey, you mean, so something bad happens, it's only, retroactively a city council member or a public citizen be like, hey, well, how did you not know that this person had epilepsy? Like, don't you think that's kind of important before you put them behind the wheel of a fire truck? I mean, maybe I'm crazy. We would say in the Army, yeah, like we don't put people with epilepsy in a helicopter, right? We don't let them pilot those things, right? We don't let somebody that had just had a heart attack go back to deploying without doing the appropriate cardiac rehab. We don't let people that get morbidly obese continue to do their job, right? Like, what happens when your belly gets so fat you can't pull back on the stick to actually move your helicopter? Am I crazy? Like, if you need a spacer to put your air pack on, or you don't have turnout gear that fits people, I'm at a loss to say that is somehow safe or that should be okay. It's not okay for the person, right? Like, we want to help them out. Like, hey man, like, dear God, I want to help you get to retirement and drain the retirement system. But there's this happy medium between personal responsibility, which health is a partially personal responsibility, but then there's also the responsibility of the leader to say, hey, I am not only responsible for you, we are public safety professionals, right? So we are in the job of, protecting the public. There's got to be a better way. And some of these mechanisms, I want to do a research with Mike and Jake, where we look at what are health metrics from departments that have a policy for mandatory physicals versus ones that have a voluntary policy versus none. I mean, I'd never get any data on a department that doesn't do physicals. Well, why would they ever? Unfortunately, they're sort of self-excluding themselves from any study like that. But I would tell you anecdotally, from what we see, is when you go to a department that actually has a policy, whether it's robust, good, or not, that's relative. But when you go from a department that's got something to a department that has nothing, or hey, we're going to provide a physical as a benefit, and you can choose to do it or not, the level of health is just drastically different. The amount of diabetes, the amount of hypertension, the amount of pre-existing cardiovascular disease, aerobic capacity, just, I could talk about that all day. Even the things such as the behavioral health metrics that we talk about, like what's the level of alcohol consumption, burnout, sleep disorders, these things all kind of run together. And so I'm just saying, hey, look, this is why the government has the Health and Human Services. We've got policy. Like, policy does work, right? Sometimes it can be overbearing. I agree. But policy's there really to protect the population, and in some place, the smaller kind of population doing high-risk jobs. And so I sort of lament that the military and the law enforcement communities call themselves paramilitary organizations, and that's true to some extent. In some cases, I'm like, this is the Wild West, man. Like, this is, you don't have choice when it comes to some of these things in the military. A pilot actually, their pay was tied to their flight pay was tied to them completing an annual physical every 12 months. They actually had to turn it into HR. So pilots were never fighting us to get a physical. They're like, hey, doc, my birthday's coming up in 90 days. I want to get in early. They knew that they were financially incentivized to be healthy. And hey, if something came up, they're like, great, what do I need to do to fix it? It's just, that's, I think, the awareness that, we're trying to bring in the fire service. Why should it be any different? Like, why would you want to do a high risk job, but then, know you've got high risk factors and you're just, want to plug your ears and pretend that they don't exist? It just baffles me. So my real passion has become using the data that we're collecting to change policy at the federal, local, state, and even departmental level, right? Like we'll start wherever we can get in, but we're building such a mass of data at this point in time across the country that someone's going to have to listen, right? Like the good news about being former military is we have a lot of friends on Capitol Hill that now work for senators and congressmen, and I'm going to keep beating this door that we've got to do better. We've got to do better. And there's not a very consistent message in the fire service, which we could go into if you want. But my passion is that, hey, we're going to have to change the future through policy. You can't write policy without data. Policy written with no data is probably a pretty crappy policy, right? So we would call that, single source or no source intelligence. We're like, oh, that looks like a bad guy. Let's go bomb it. Then you bomb a schoolhouse, right, or an orphanage because you're doing things without actually having some data, some multi-source intelligence to back up why you're going to do something. So
I definitely want to talk about policy change and implementation, but I want to go back. I have some listeners that are providers. So they are strength coaches, dietitians, et cetera, et cetera. And you said 3 things that I have been beating the drum on, but I want to reiterate them. The first one was you became culturally competent by doing ride-alongs, talking to firefighters, talking. Number 1. Number 2, the training and safety chief is always, I shouldn't say always, most likely your best person to communicate with. And the other thing is this takes freaking time. You said 18 months. Sometimes it can take 3 to 5 years. If you are a one horse show, it could take 3 to 5 years. Yeah. But I wanted to reiterate that for the providers out there. Anything to add to that before we go on to policy?
Absolutely. So, hey, look, when Mike and I were flight surgeons, we had minimum flying hour requirements, meaning we had to go fly with our patients. Why? Because when they come into your office with neck pain and back pain and depression or trouble with their vision, you got to appreciate that. Like, boy, after flying one night mission with nods and the weight bag and everything for 6 hours with a Chinook crew, and I'm like, God, my neck is just killing me. And these people do it day in and day out. And then you think about all the different inputs that they have. So my point is that, if you don't embed yourself, if you don't appreciate, if you don't put turnout gear on, if you've never done a consumption test, you should do a CPAT. Appreciate it. Helps you be more relatable to the patients when you're talking to them, right? You can speak their language. The health and safety chief, you will sink or swim based off of how motivated that person is. That is the glue. We are not firefighters. We don't go into buildings. So if you don't have that connective glue, you don't have your champion. You turn a 3 to 5 year fight into a 15, 20 year fight, basically until that person retires and you get somebody that's actually passionate about it, right? Because they have to push it internally. What was the third one? I'm sorry.
It takes time, training and safety. You hit them all. Cultural competency.
Yeah. Yep. You got to be in it for the long haul, right? Like, are you in it for fulfillment or are you somehow in it to win? If you haven't read Simon Sinek's book, The Infinite Game, you should. But are you playing to win or are you playing to be fulfilled? If you're playing to be fulfilled, you can weather however long it takes, right? Because you're kind of on a mission. If you're playing to win, then, every time you don't get what you think you're supposed to be getting, you get more deflated and you back off and you'll quit before that. So couldn't agree more.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And the other thing that I always tell those providers is there's those 2 strategies, like burn the boats and side hustle. Do not burn the boats. Do not.
Yeah, within the fire department, you mean, or just quit, like burn the boat and quit, you mean?
Meaning, like, if you are a physical therapist, do not quit your job as a physical therapist and go all in on the fire department because you will starve to death.
Yeah.
Gotta have a side hustle.
Yeah, until you find your sweet spot, like Vanessa, you find the right department and then you've got it. But they are few and far between for sure. There's no doubt.
Absolutely. Okay, so I want to talk about policy because policy is scary. It's scary for the personnel. It's scary for the administration. What's going to happen? It's just so frightening, but also it can work smoothly if you're doing it correctly. So talk to us about how the hell you do this.
Sure. So I'll just broadly say, hey, look, here's my kind of 3 points for what a whole health and wellness policy should include, or at least 3 separate policies. And again, Annette, not proprietary information, right? Remember, go back to the original charter. Can you do what you did in the Army for us in the fire service? So this is how we did it in the Army, right? So in a high risk job, higher risk than even being a regular soldier, right? If you were a dive person, if you were a halo jumper, if you were aviator, right? You had your regular soldier, and then you had a higher risk job than the rest of the population. You had other requirements you had to do. So look, an annual medical exam, look, that's we just need to make sure if stuff's coming off the wheels, we just need to catch it early. Because what we want to do is not let you have a major medical issue, but stuff's going to happen, right? Like age is the greatest risk factor for all disease. So we just need to find it early and intervene. That's all we're trying to do, right? But the medical is only basically saying, well, you should be able to do X, Y, or Z job. The truth of the matter is that you actually should be validating that by somebody who actually knows the job, right? So someone would come to Mike and I's office, hey, yep, man, medically, you look good. Nothing's changed. We don't need to do anything with you this year. We'll see you in a year. Here's your upslip. Go. Then they take it to their, chief instructor pilot, who then says, oh, okay, you passed your flight. Now we got to do our skills check, right? So I don't care if you're a 35-year veteran of the military, you're the longest serving chief warrant officer, best tactical, pilot that we have. They still have to do a check ride every year with another pilot to make sure, can you still wiggle sticks? Has your belly gotten so big you can't pull the stick back anymore? Like, hey man, that's a problem. Do you still have the reaction time, right? Like, hey, it's just making sure you can really do the job, right? Medically, I said, hey, well, you should be able to do jobs. You should have a medical policy. Then you should have an occupational policy to be like, hey, you should validate your skills at some interval, whether it's a year, 2 years, I guess I don't care. Think of something like the Firefighter Combat Challenge. I know CPAT, you only do it when we're hiring people, but hey man, I don't care. Put it in a different sequence and call it something else, right? Like is pulling a ladder, pulling a hose, breaking in a building, pulling victims, doing CPR, like all these things, are they not critical? They're all critical. And sometimes you don't look, we have a lot of small departments that maybe get 300 calls a year. So you're not getting the reps at a busy station where you're getting to do all those things. So how do we validate that the one time you get it, you got to check, right? So we checked every year on high risk jobs. And then the last one is a fitness component, right? And I'm not going to get into the Mike and you and Jake can, negate, you can fight about that word. But the reality is just, hey, do you just have a base level of fitness, right? Like in some ways it's an accountability tool. And a lot of our fire departments offset their annual physical with 6 months later doing a fitness assessment, right? We all need those things to keep ourselves motivated to stay, hey, look, staying healthy is part of this job. And so we can put these things in. So the 3 big ones are medically, can you do the job? Fitness-wise, do you have a base level of fitness for acceptance in this department? I don't care what that is, right? Is it a 2-mile run and 2 minutes of push-ups and sit-ups? I don't care. Anything's better than nothing, and I know Mike said that. And then a true, honest, like, can you still do the job, right? Like, stuff can happen, and if you're never checking, I mean, dang, it's sort of like negligence on our part. If we were to put a pilot in the air that we knew couldn't wiggle sticks anymore, we're like, oh yeah, just go ahead. And then they crashed and died or hurt somebody else. Man, I mean, I don't know how you look at that person's family or anything in the face and say, yeah, we did all we could, but we didn't want to hurt his feelings, so we let his fat ass fly. You know what I mean? Like, where is the rub? And so policy, in a lot of ways, right, needs to be fair, transparent, clear, and pre-stated before you try to enforce it, right? But once you have that, hey, the reason it can be scary is, well, you're just afraid of the unknown. We've never done it before. And I get it. Like, the Army is a national organization. It's easy to write policy at the Pentagon. And you know what? Like, the lowest squad, the lowest platoon in Korea is like, yep, roger that. We're going to do it. The fire service is not that way. I totally get that. The NFPA is not legislative, right? There's not law. From what I've been told, the U.S. Fire Administrator doesn't have that much power. It's very difficult. I get that. So I think that in the fire service, the idea is what's actually more freeing is that you can write policy, yourself for your department that applies to your call volume, the type of area you live in, the type of people that work there. I think that, it needs to be customizable. So you don't have to take a large approach like, oh, we got to do everything like the Army. I'm just saying that. Just say, hey, there's your 3 components. Now you get to talk to your staff, your team, and say, hey, this is all so that we can get to retirement and drain the retirement system. If you die in a fire because you couldn't wear your SCBA right, or you burned through your 45-minute bottle in 6 minutes and had a syncopal episode, well, then you didn't get to retirement and you didn't get to drain the retirement system, right? That's the way I look at it. If you kill yourself before getting to retirement, then the same thing, right? So this is what I'm very passionate about, is like, hey, some of these things are to put bumpers in place to make sure we get to the ultimate goal, which is, right, like getting everybody through a whole public safety career healthy and whole and ready for the next chapter of life, whatever that is. Like, I'm agnostic. Again, I go back to saying, look, I want you to be fulfilled, not just now, but even when you get out of the service. And so some of these things about policy is like, well, what are we doing as leaders to create the structure to try to guarantee that happens, right? So you say, well, it's scary. Well, what happens if you don't? You're really just waiting for the grenade to go off, because most, what is it? Necessity is the mother of all invention. Oh, well, now we had this big event. I guess we should do something now. I'm like, all right. I mean, that's a way. That is a way. Or, you could just listen to all the people that come on your podcast, right? Like, this isn't new information. I wish I could tell you I'm being earth shattering here. I just think I'm trying to be more aggressive to say, what are we doing here? Like we're wasting our time. And I would encourage, all fire service and public safety leaders to be like, hey, policies to protect you and the employee, right? Like, it goes both ways. And then you let them know, like, hey, here's the standards for working in our high performing organization. But ultimately, it's so you can do your job well and you can get out of this job whole, right? And live on to the next part of what you're going to do. Because I think that gets lost in translation, that it's everybody, you said this on previous podcasts, that there's all these very suspicious people. And so I just keep trying to break that down and be like, well, you know what, if you can't get over that, then that somehow everybody's out to take your job. I sort of laugh because we talk to fire chiefs and police chiefs all the time. People are not lining up. I mean, Annette, let me ask you. So when you applied to be a firefighter, just a few years ago, how many positions were open and how many people applied?
So 600.
Mm-hmm. And how many open positions?
We actually did hire about 15 at my department, but it was like the next time we hired was like 1. Right.
So you just caught it at the right, but 600 applicants for 15 slots, right? And that's the way I'm told it used to be. There's a very great department we have kind of in the central Texas area, well-to-do, lots of tax revenue. It's not like they're hurting for anything. They were on a 48-96 schedule before anybody else, right? They really progressive and take care of their people. They pay them well. And the chief there, when he applied, so he was a young firefighter, became the chief. When he applied, 20 something years ago, one position, 350 people. He was the one guy that got selected. Now he's the chief. He said, Russ, I had 7 open positions and I had 6 qualified applicants. 6, like, you didn't even have qualified applicants for this. And then you look at, like, do people want to be cops these days? Are you kidding me? Like, I'm just going to throw shade and be like, if you think that police chiefs and fire chiefs are somehow trying to put people out of the job, I was like, who do you think they're going to go get? Like, people are not lining up to do this job like they once were. And so the intent is like, well, how do we take care of the force we have? How do we make sure these people can stay here and healthy? And if you really care about them, sometimes you got to put rules in to make sure people, there's some personal responsibility. Some people can do it on their own and some people need, is it carrot or stick, right? We can say, well, the carrot is you get to retirement and get to see your grandkids and travel the world and do all these fun things. And sometimes that works for people. And sometimes, like, well, I want to get you there, but you don't seem to care about that. So I guess I'll have to put a policy in place to say, well, if you don't go that way, we'll just sort of beat you to that point. And there comes a point in time where it's like, hey, man, like, we are in a public safety job. This is a high risk job. At some point in time, I want to be a Victoria's Secret model too, right? But I just wasn't born with those things. I joke because I loved playing basketball in high school. And you know what? Like, I was not gifted with the speed, nor the jumping height, nor the shot. And so even though I loved it, like I wanted nothing more than to play basketball for the University of Arizona. And there was just no way in hell that it was. But you gotta go through the stages of grief, right? I was angry and I was depressed. But now I've moved to the thing of where I am totally accepting of that. And I'm the biggest U of A fan that you could possibly meet. And I'm okay with that. But I get it, right? Like I can appreciate where people come from, that sometimes, hey, we want to be able to do things. And sometimes the reality is we don't have it anymore, or we never had it. And that's not necessarily the easiest conversation to have, but it is what's the safest conversation to have.
From this side of the microphone, I see two big mud puddles that departments step in. Mud puddle number one is creating an arbitrary standard, such as the chief can do 25 push-ups, so that's the standard. And then mud puddle two is what happens when someone doesn't meet the standard. There's really nothing in place to help the person that didn't meet the standard. So talk to me about, how do we systematize this so that it just is boom, boom, boom. The standard makes sense. It's out there. And when you don't meet the standard, here's what happens.
Absolutely. So we talked about policy has to be easily consumable, transparent, and easily enforceable too, right? So to your first point, this goes back to my intelligence comment. I was sort of tongue-in-cheek saying that, in the military, we called it, you really try to not do operations off a single source intelligence. That's how people get hurt, right? So your example is, well, the chief could do 25 push-ups, so that's a single source. How big's the department, right? Like, how old is the chief? That could work in your favor or against you. Well, the chief can only do 5 push-ups, so that's the standard, right? Like, your chief is a huge, fitness nut. Yeah, you could really ostracize a lot of people, but the same could be true. Well, he can only do 5, so that's the standard here. So making policy decisions without data is very dangerous, right? And so I think the first step in creating policy is that you got to collect the data, right? You got to go collect the intel. That's the way, because no fire department is the same. I do not subscribe, nor would I, advise, but still just blatantly adopt this policy from this department. You can use it as a guideline for sure, right? You could talk to them about what works, what doesn't. But your fire department is different. I mean, we work with hundreds of fire departments, and none of them are the same. Even the ones that are right next to each other, they do mutual aid, auto aid, all this stuff. They train together, and you know what? They are totally different. Totally different. You can't apply. So what you do is you collect the data, and then we say, what's the strategy behind the policy? What do we want to go after? So what we encourage people is, look at what's out there. What are the 3 big killers of firefighters, right? Depends on who you ask. This is where I'd also go to sort of like, it's a joke, and I get frustrated, and I've sort of upset a lot of people in the old guard to be like, hey man, like, there's no consistency, right? If you go to the U.S. Fire Administrator's website and you look at what are the line of duty deaths, heart attacks up there, right? Cancer's not up there. But wait, I thought the Cancer Support Network says cancer is the #1 line of duty death, but the U.S. Fire Administrator's website doesn't even have cancer listed. Then if you talk to the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance, they'll say, oh, well, suicide outpaces line of duty deaths 3 to 1, which could be true. But again, you go to the U.S. Fire Administrator's website, suicide's not even on there, right? Like there's zero consensus of these things. So what we say is, hey, look, okay, so let's just shoot from the hip here and say, okay, so cardiovascular disease, cancer, suicide, they're all freaking important, right? They're all important. They all kill firefighters. So maybe we should stop focusing on one and just say, what can we do the best for all 3? So the strategy of policy is, okay, well, what kind of data can you collect behavioral health wise? What are your people struggling from? Suicide is the culminating event of many, many things. Right? Like if you look at people who study, it's not just, oh, I just had a bad day and I do it. It's, I've been having a bad decade, right? I've had a divorce, a bankruptcy. Yes, I've seen bad calls. There comes a point in time where there's just so much pain, they don't want to deal with the pain anymore. But that doesn't usually happen overnight, right? This is a long kind of burn. And so we look at this suicide, we look at the behavioral health data, we look at the cancer data. Hey, but the cancer one I sort of blow off because you guys are already doing a lot, right? You're doing 2 sets of gear wash, gear exchange, clean cabs, vestibules, clean stations, decon, cancer screenings, right? Like, I think the fire service, no PFAS, no PFAS, like I get it, right? The fire service is doing a lot there. It's kind of hard to write policy, then wear your gear, decon it, make sure you're not bringing your dirty crap in the firehouse, actually follow the policy so that, it's like, oh, it's a pain in the ass to wash my gear. It's like, so there's policy there on the cancer side. But the cardiovascular one is the one that I think is the most sort of nebulous and hardest to wrap around. And you've talked a lot about this on your other ones. But, you have to say, okay, those are the three big ones. And so the cardiovascular data is actually the richest to collect, though. Like, that's the one where we really have the opportunity to really just kind of be like, hey, man, it's like we have all the data, right? We just need to start putting this stuff into action. And I guess that's where I get frustrated, to be like, most people aren't talking about anything new. It's like, what are we fucking talking about? Like, we're not talking about anything new. Yes, I know LDL is a risk factor. I know that body fat is a risk factor. What are we doing about it? We're just going to keep talking about the risk factor? Like, so the point that the next step is, well, we put it in policy that we're going to go after these things, right? Like, we're going to, make sure that we're addressing them. Again, I don't know why. Maybe you can enlighten me. Everybody talks about cancer. Everybody's concerned about that. We've done so much work and all that. I'm good. Like, it's great. We've known about cardiovascular disease in the fire service longer than we have cancer, and it's still a mess. It's still, there's no consensus, right? It changes all the time. And you look at the newest version of 1582, it's like, also I'd say, hey, there's a pretty dangerous spot for a fire department. Just blatantly accept a single source. Just like, hey, well, we follow the most recent version of 1582. If you did that just now, since the temporary interim amendment at the late last year, you would have just thrown your whole fire department into a conundrum, because they moved how they evaluated aerobic capacity. And oh boy, if you get a little example, we did a new hire class for a department here in Texas, 28 applicants. If you would have applied the old standard from just last fall, all 28 would have passed, met the aerobic capacity standard. If you would have applied what blanketly, I'm just going to accept 1582 as the standard, 11 of those 26, 28 folks wouldn't have passed. And 90% of them were less than 20, right? So this is where your single source intelligence, right? Like, oh, well, it is best practices. I mean, I know NFPA and all the people on the committees are doing the best they can, but the practicality of that, and that's where I'm really kind of driving home the message, is that you got to make a policy that's appropriate for you, right? And you really need to think about, oh, can I just blatantly accept 1582? Boy, before they came out with the 2022 version, testosterone is an anabolic steroid. That's why it's banned in the Olympics. Anabolic steroid use was a no-go. Like, that was a job limiting medical condition. If you required the use or was using anabolic steroids, it said you couldn't do essential job tasks 1, 3, 5, 7, 13, whatever. Are you kidding me? Nobody would be able to staff trucks in Texas if we did that, right? Like I'm just telling you the truth, right? Like, it is a thing. And so your whole point is that, hey, look, you got to come up with something for yourself. Be very careful about accepting just one single source. I don't care what it is. The best approach would be to go get the intelligence on your organization, and then you step back non-punitively, look back and say, okay, hey, what are the things that are really important to us? I would think they would be cardiovascular disease, cancer, and suicide. And so then you decide what those things are, right? And maybe you just go after a few. Hell, if you're going from nothing to something, how about we just have a minimum aerobic capacity number in this fire department? At a bare minimum, let's just have that. That's a good start. We'll see where we go from there. Forget blood pressure. You can have sky-high blood pressure. We're just going to start with something, right? I'd say that something is better than nothing when it comes to this. I'd say that aerobic capacity is the single greatest opportunity to help all disease, right? So if I was to advise a department, I say, hey, look, you need to come up with an aerobic capacity standard for you. And that's where, the chief could be a gangster and have a VO2 of 50, or he could be one that is almost at have heart failure and have a VO2 of 19. You don't want to base your standard on that. You need to take a whole kind of snapshot of the population and say, okay, where do we fall? And a lot of times the departments have to start a lot lower than they think they wanted to. Hey, they want to start at a VO2 of 25. Wow, if we did that, we'd have to take a quarter of our force off the truck. So you know what? we're going to start lower. And we are going to work towards incrementally improving that by, and I think that's the thing about policy too, is that it's not written in stone, man. Dear Lord, like, you can rewrite it as often as you want. And as you get new intelligence, you should rewrite it. You should update it. You should add to it as you learn and grow. But, my advice is don't use single source intelligence. You collect your own data, right? Use the resources on your website, the people, the geniuses that you have on this, and say, hey, let's focus on the things that are most likely to kill our men and women in a structure fire. I'd probably say start that. Like, you're not going to die of cancer in a structure fire. Might happen afterwards, right? I know it's a line of duty death in a lot of states. I'm just saying, like, hey, what's most likely to kill you before you can even get to chemo, right? Having a heart attack or a stroke or a syncopal episode in a structure fire is going to do it, right? You're not only going to become a victim yourself, you're going to put your team in danger. So, I say, hey, look, that's a great place to start. And if you want to look at the data on that, you don't even have to look outside the fire service. Fire service is just a microcosm of the general population. Cardiovascular disease is still the number one all-cause mortality for men and women worldwide. So just start there. Just start there, right? Just start there, right? There is so much data out there already. But, I say, hey, look at what everyone else is doing, but then do it yourself. Like, look at yours. Just say, hey, we are our own unique flower. We need to do it. We need to come up with something that and your culture better. You know how it's going to go. And usually, look, it's easier to implement if, start low and go slow. That's kind of how we would do it in medicine is, you don't just, pound somebody with the max daily dose of a medication. You're like, hey man, like we're going to start you low. We're going to start you, half a tablet once 3 times a week. And then we're going to move up to a full tablet, every day. And then we can increase it's not foreign, right? Like, I think if we can maybe put some different analogies on it is that, hey, with policy, start low and go slow. Something is better than nothing. And go after the big hitters. Go after the ones that are most likely to kill your people and the ones you can affect the most, right? Cardiovascular disease by far and away is the single greatest preventable cause that we can go after. So I think that was a long answer, very tangential question to your first answer. And then the thing is, what do you do with people? So I create a standard. And then what do I do if people fail? Well, at least that's the right question, right? At least you're considering like, okay, well, I've got a bare minimum of what it takes to do this job. And so what happens? I'd argue that, IFF puts out tons of peer fitness all the time, right? I go to departments all the time and I say, well, do you have peer fitness? They'll ask me this question, Russ, what do I do if a guy fails his physical and doesn't meet our own standard that we set? What do I do with them? I was like, well, do you have peer support? 90% of all fire departments have, not peer support, but peer fitness. They're like, oh yeah, we pay tens of thousands of dollars to send people to do these things. Like, okay, well, use your resources. Now, here's your list of, here's the people that you can help the most with the things you've already done. There's tons of outside resources. You've had these people on your podcast. There's apps, there's workshops, there's, the whole thing. But you're right. The key is that if you're going to have a standard, the second question is, okay, what do we do if somebody doesn't meet the standard or our own policy? I think you have to have a reasonable rehab policy, right? Like, hey, let's give the firefighters, let's make sure, have they gone to their doctor to make sure there's nothing medically wrong? Have we, provided them, observed, guided, most exercise is the best medicine. So most of the stuff we're really talking about in that is just exercise, right? Like most of the people that fail out of policies is really primarily for aerobic capacity, right? Like deconditioning. They've just become so deconditioned that they're really not healthy nor safe. Much rarer is it a medical condition, and some of those things are easily fixable, right? Hell, you have new onset hypertension. Okay, great, man. Hey, if you're not obese and you're working out and you're passing the fitness test and everything else is all normal, your aerobic capacity is good, you just need to take blood pressure medication. Like that's how we keep you safe. It's like wearing your seatbelt. Those things are easy. It's the things that take a little bit of time that people get afraid of. But you're right. If you're not going to have a performance improvement plan, yeah, you might best well be served by not having a policy, but it will come back to bite you at some point in time. Like it will be catastrophic, and it probably could have been avoidable. So that's not the reason to not do it. But yes, that is the second order effect, is that if you are going to have a policy, what do you do when you don't? I think you always, again, assume positive intent, that person wants that job. So what can we do to help them? And a lot of times it's just a conversation like, hey, Joe, what can we do to help you, man? Like, what's going on? Like you said earlier, like, be a good dude. Like, hey, man, like, it looks like you're really struggling when it comes to like your health and fitness. Like, what's going on, man? Like, tell me, like, what can we do to help you? Where are you struggling? And I think that just opening up that conversation is super helpful. And when was the last time someone just asked them how they were doing and what could they do to help them? I think that that's, something that's not happening a lot either. But yes, broad, it's hard to specifically say, but the broad answer to your second question is you have to have a performance improvement plan, and you have to have gates, right? People without deadlines usually won't do it. And so, can we get them back on the truck in 12 months, right? Usually we'd say, hey, 12 months is a reasonable amount of time to fix something. Sometimes it can happen faster. Sometimes as we get older, at the Fort Worth, I know you've talked to Brian before, we have a sliding scale. The older you are, the more time we give you to recover from an injury or a new onset of a medical thing, because we know it's just easier. It's harder to recover when you're older than when you're younger. So we acknowledge that. But we still have trucks to staff. We still have jobs to do. And so, you can't, how long can you keep somebody on the payroll that can't do the job? That's a social question, a financial question for the department. But, the Army couldn't do that. Like, we can't keep people on the payroll that can't deploy, right? Like, what do you want me to do? I mean, we got the American people are expecting us to do the government's wishes when we go over there, and we go, we can't do the job. Like, I don't think that would go over very well. But it's not an argument used very much in public safety, from what I can tell.
I'm going to go back to, you asked a question. I can't remember how you phrased it. You said, I don't understand why. I can't remember the question, but I'm going to give you the answer to the question.
Sure.
The answer is this. The officers at the fire department have no problem saying to a candidate or a personnel, like, you did a shitty job throwing that ladder. You need to practice that more. And then watching them practice it. You deployed that hose line really slow. We need to work on that. But for some reason, when it comes to physical fitness, because it's your own body, people have a hard time taking the advice and also dishing out the advice. And so that's like a barrier to entry, and I don't know how to get past it sometimes.
Yeah, so in some ways, the policy is what, again, provides that protective parachute, right? Because you're waiting for leaders to lead, though, right? Like, if you're a hot shit captain and you're trying to help someone that's slow on pulling the hose line or can't throw that ladder right, and you see it, and you're like, hey, man, we got to do this. And it'd also be like, hey, it's time, when we get back to the station, it's time to do PT, because you know what? Like, we've got this standard, and we got physical fitness training, testing coming up in 6 months. We've got our physical. We got to do this. It points to that. Like, we knew that in the military. Like, it wasn't a question like, why did we do PT every day? Why did you, hey, your job damn well depended on it. So it's one of those things. And I think that's where young leaders actually are looking for some top cover to be like, hey, well, if I had something to point to, it would be a lot easier, because it wouldn't be me attacking them on being out of shape or me attacking them on not being healthy. Be like, hey, brother, like, this is the rule here. This is the standard in our fire department. So what can I do to help you meet it? I do think that it's just, we create things, or we just, hey, no news is good news. And so I just don't want to be considered a jerk. And if there's no teeth to it, you could call him fat and out of shape. But he's like, why? I don't care. Call me that. It's not like there's no repercussions. I can be as unhealthy and fat as I want. With no teeth, what are you going to do? How do you get that captain to help that person? How do you get a firefighter to call a captain out to be like, hey, Cap, you're my leader. You're supposed to lead from the front, man. Like, they see that. It's an accountability tool either, right? Like, it becomes an accountability tool. And actually, when you put it in place, what I would tell you in that is that you actually start to see more competition. You start to see people wanting to be better once they understand the physiology, why it's important. You redirect them to be like, dude, this is so not about you right now. This is about, I don't want to, so if a patient is 36, I say, hey man, I don't want to talk to you at 36. Let's talk to your 86-year-old self right now. If we do right by that person, all the rest of this stuff will take care of itself. It is changing, maybe it's changing the narrative from, oh man, I'm off the truck right now, to be like, dude, like you're out of life early if we don't do this stuff. So let's just take a larger aperture and say it is less about you being on the truck right now. It's more about you getting to retirement so you can do everything you want to do, receive all the benefits you've earned. And that's just a lot less accusatory. That's definitely how we approach it. That's just who we are. We're like, as we genuinely care about people, it's like, dude, I really could care less about you riding the fire truck this year. I want you riding your fire truck at 86, whatever that is. That's what I'm interested in. And if we take care of that man or woman, dude, the next year will take care of itself. It just is really that simple. And so it's a very much of a mind shift of thinking about that. And regular medicine is not prepared to do that. And regular medicine is, hey, Ned, what do you need? I got 30 more patients behind you, so I can get you what you need, and then you need to get them office because I got to get another person in here, right? Maybe that's been your experience, maybe not, but that's classically what we saw, and we're trying to change the narrative by getting them to think bigger about their health.
Such a good way to think of it too. So if you were able to just give some parting wisdom to, let's say, 2 departments, not the individual firefighters, 2 departments, what would you say to them?
A robust health and wellness policy in a department has 3 arms: medical, but medical is just telling you if you should be able to do the job. You need to have a fitness component to say, hey, look, like fitness, you guys are in a high risk job. There's a base level of fitness needed to be a firefighter. So do we have the base fitness to do the job? And then thirdly, do you check once a year, occupationally assess, can they do the job? Have you lost a step on throwing the ladder? If not, let's focus on that. Can we still pull the 4-inch hose? Okay, good. We can do that. Can we still drive the truck without having a syncopal episode, right? Like all of these things. So that's the 3-prong approach. That a robust policy starts there. I'd say the easiest ones is fitness. And, occupational, you already got all the equipment, you already do all the stuff. So just start, a mandatory, occupational assessment once a year. That's a great place to start. And then if you do a medical or a fitness, start low and go slow. Make everybody do it, make it non-punitive while you collect the data, and then look at your data over 1, 2, or even 3 years and say, hey, okay, now we've got multiple data points. We can kind of come up with a center of mass for our organization, and let's start with something. And then I think lastly is you just have to know that policy actually protects both the employee and the department, but after an event is the wrong time to do it.
So dang good. But also we have to talk about, do you have a dog?
I have a dog, yeah, but I'm actually a crazy cat lady. I have I have 7 cats, and
and 7 kids.
7 kids, 7 cats, 1 cat per kid. Yeah.
Holy shit. Okay, tell me about the dog. I'm allergic to the cats.
Yeah, it's we're pretty Norman Rockwell. He's a golden retriever named Bailey. He loves everybody. He's the happiest dog you've ever met. He, when we get UPS or Amazon to drop stuff off at our house, we kind of have a long driveway because we live on a farm. He jumps in the vehicle with them and rides up the thing. And, if we had a safe full of gold and diamonds, he would invite the stranger in and be like, hey, come right here, man. Let me show you. So he's great. He's the happiest dog ever. And he loves the cats. They get along great. And he's just a good family dog.
He's a good dude.
He is a good dude. Yeah. The poor guy doesn't know any other way to do it. So yeah.
Well, Russ, this has been an amazing conversation, and I hope that this pushes the needle for departments and firefighters that are apprehensive about this, because I think it is so, so, so important.
Yeah, it's an honor being here. Thank you for having me.
Should we drop the mic?
Sure, we can drop it.
Okay. This has been AZ and Russ from Frontline, and we are officially out dropping the mic. Boom.
Lead from the front.
Lead from the front.